Edinburgh City. I'm Stuart Brown. I'm the interim CEO of the Scotland-Malawi Partnership. We're a membership organisation which exists to support, connect and represent the many individuals and organisations in Scotland with dignified people-to-people two-way links with Malawi. We're thrilled to be joined by author Alexander Chula to discuss his critically acclaimed work, Goodbye, Dr. Banda. It strikes me as a remarkable book. It's beautifully written, researched with great scholarship, as well as being a personal account, has a firm foot in the classical world alongside the complex Dr. Hastings Kamuzu Banda. At the same time, we're in Malawi, both in the time continuum that is the village with its rich cultural practices and the singularly otherworldly world of Kamuzu Academy, where the brightest village children with scholarships swap mud and straw shelters for straw boaters and Greek and Latin primers. Alexander, in reading your book, I imagined you as something of a time traveller, taking the Western reader on a journey in and out of antiquity to grapple with how to engage with this fascinating place, Malawi, economically poor and culturally affluent. Why should the global North be interested in the story of Malawi?
Well, thanks very much for the very flattering introduction, Stuart. So you're quite right. It's obviously a very small, mostly overlooked country, and you could reasonably say, why should anyone outside pay much attention to Malawi? It does have a fascinating indigenous culture, but that's seldom enough to attract the attention of most people outside. What I was interested in Malawi is the history of its interaction with Westerners. And it's an interaction that's, as you say, got an extended history. It starts with Livingstone and the early missionaries, because obviously it's the land that was first opened up by Livingstone. It goes through the colonial era, when it was part of the British Empire, and then it extends to the present day, where Malawi is so much a focus for the attentions of the international aid community, tourists, and latterly Madonna. And it was having this conspectus of different approaches to the country's culture that struck me as interesting. This country's got it's sort of experienced the whole gamut of the best and worst of Western culture that's just been thrown at it over successive generations. And that enables us to do a sort of compare and contrast. And that's sort of the core of the book. Now, I could, I suppose, have written a similar book set in a country in Latin America or Southeast Asia. But the additional thing that was interesting in Malawi's case for me, and the thing that I focus on in the book, is that a lot of that contact with Western culture has been with a high Western culture, as we used until fairly recently to call it. It's been with the high artistic tradition of the West, but also specifically with the classical tradition. And that's what I think marks Malawi cultural history as particularly unusual, and what provides particularly instructive contrast with us today, because that tradition of bringing the best that Western culture had to offer is something that I feel has died off significantly in how we interact, not just with Malawi, but elsewhere with the world in more recent times.
I think, for the benefit of our audience, you're kindly angled to me, but probably if you angle it out to the audience.
Okay, I was actually
the mistake of our
my instinct was to shift my chair 45 degrees.
Yeah. And can we hear you? Can everybody hear Alex? No.
Okay, right. Who needs to?
Social. Would you like to come forward a bit, maybe? It's not me. People want to see as well.
We could see how we go with me facing you, and
that's better.
Yeah, but do shout if it's still difficult to hear, and then we can sort of reshuffle the room.
The book tells us something of your career, and with interesting parallels with the characters that you so vividly depict. But tell us, if you would, how you ended up in Malawi and what drew you to Kamuzu Academy.
So, I had no prior connection with Malawi. I was there entirely by accident. I'm a medical doctor, but I've got a background in classics, so I took a very circuitous route into medicine. And after completing my classics degree, I looked at the routes being taken by my peers, which were mostly into law, finance, and they did not appeal to me. So I looked for alternatives. And then I saw an advert for a job to teach Latin and Greek in the middle of Africa. And apart from anything else, it was probably the only job on the entire continent I was actually qualified to do. But I'd heard rumor of this mythical school because a Greek, one of the ancient Greek masters at my school when I was in A level, had told us about this extraordinary place in the middle of Africa where, yes, Latin and Greek are studied, and the pupils wear straw boaters, and the entire place is modelled on Eton College, and it's been founded by a president who prefers to wear morning coat and tails. So already I had this, yes, this hint of what it might be like in the back of my head, and when I saw the advert, I went for it pretty impulsively.
Great. And, as the positive critique of the likes of Felix and Tally and others attest, this is an extremely respectful and thoroughly well-researched book. Are you ever challenged about writing about Africa as a non-African? And if so, how do you answer and how do you feel about the question?
So I suppose the first thing to say is that I don't actually feel like I'm writing about Africa in particular. I'm writing my focus, and especially the focus of my polemic, insofar as there is polemic in the book, is actually directed towards Westerners. They're my subjects, they're my target. And it's how they interact with the rest of the world. And my experience happened to be in Malawi, but it might have been somewhere else, very easily somewhere else. And I could have written a similar, I think I could have identified similar phenomena in how they behave outside the West if I'd been elsewhere. But more generally, that's my sort of, I suppose, get out for this particular book. But more generally, I do push back against this idea that you can't write about a place unless that's where you're from. I think that an outsider's view is often the most instructive that you can receive, whether it's in your personal life or your national life, societal life. And I think you're closing yourself off to such an important array of perspectives if you say that can't be done. And I would certainly welcome, I really would welcome the input of Malawians, Asians, for their critique on the West. In fact, some of the most interesting conversations I've had about the cultural catastrophe as I see it unfolding in the West at the moment has come from people who are outside, from friends from China, from Malawi, who see it with a clear-sightedness that I think we really lack here. And I suppose I'm not completely without sympathy for the cultural appropriation idea. I don't completely subscribe to the idea that it's complete nonsense and we should have no time for anyone who lays that charge. But I think you need to have some perspective and some proportionality and think about what you're missing if you turn down the opinions of outsiders. And the last thing I'd probably say as well is I've never actually experienced any Malawian who's been resistant to hearing an outside voice. The resistance to that I've experienced is always from Westerners, or occasionally from Malawians who perhaps have been through the grievance mill of the Western academic system. If you speak to Malawians, I've never encountered that attitude, but Westerners are very, very sort of, they want to still act in the place of surrogate protector and ensure that Africa can't hear these alien voices. I was really hoping I could participate in this literary festival in Nairobi, actually. And it was very disappointing when they wrote back and said, no, you can't, because I'm afraid this is going to be exclusively for Black African writers. Now, of course, who was it who wrote back to me? It was the German lady who runs the Goethe Institute in Malawi, and she's taken charge of the whole operation.
You recognise certain parallels in the book between yourself and Kumuzu Banda. You both switched to medicine, both loving and inhabiting the classical world. And you're saying in the book, to discover my connection with people and places I had, like Banda, to turn to stories from the past, classics, history, literature. Does the connection with Banda sit with you in any particular way, or is it the experience of Malawi and your classical lens that's meaningful?
So, I mean, I've had to tread carefully with this because Banda is obviously, his rule is obviously a highly sensitive subject for a lot of Malawians, and I've not, in my book, tried at all to make any sort of political appraisal of Banda. I've really tried not to pass judgment on his legacy because I think that's something for Malawians to do. And the portrait I painted of him has been more concerned with his personality and especially his cultural concerns. Now, obviously, I couldn't avoid talking about what happened politically under his regime. But I hope that I've taken a sort of middle course with that and not omitted the corruption, the brutality, the mismanagement, but also set that aside, the positive achievements. And I'm cautiously encouraged that from the responses I'm getting, the supporters of Banda have complained that it's not adulatory enough, and the critics of Banda have complained that it's not critical enough. So that sort of reassures me that I've managed to keep a bit of a middle course. Having said all that, on a personal level, yes, in a again a slightly uncomfortable way, I did pick out affinities. Partly it was the structure of his career. So the fact that he'd been drawn to the classics first of all, and then moved to medicine. So on a sort of fairly humdrum level, there was that. But it was more than that actually. It was. I'm half Thai. My father's from Thailand. My mother's British, and my perspective, I feel, has always been somewhat that of a partial outsider, whether I'm in Asia or in Britain, which is not to say I've ever felt uncomfortable or unwelcome or anything of the sort, but conscious of my own difference and my different perspective on things. And for me, classics was a way of simultaneously trying to get to the root of a culture that otherwise I didn't feel I could necessarily grapple with. And simultaneously, it was a sort of neutral ground that transcended national differences. And I felt that there was something similar in Banda's approach. And that was really where the main affinity I felt lay. It's that he also is someone who is obviously deeply, deeply attached to his home country, but he's severed from it so early on. He severs himself from it so early on. And when he does finally get back, he's so much a stranger in the place that people look at him and he might as well come from the moon. And yet, however rigorously he embraced Western culture, he was also an outsider here. And so it's that feeling doubly an outsider, whichever place he went, that I particularly felt an affinity with.
Reflecting on the sense of fit and village lineage as you see it of the burned girl, Mistress Angala Flemings and Lysard Moyo, and their, quotes, instinctual rightfulness to their place in the world. You speak of yourself as an anywhere person, but in Malawi, quote, could observe from a distance what it meant to belong somewhere. So there's a sense of belonging and place or identity through your time there.
Yes, indeed, which certainly I felt was to an extent, was certainly compared with that sort of existence, was lacking in my own. I mean, I grew up in South London in burgeoning multiculturalism, which I have to admit I became disenchanted with pretty early on. And so it was incredibly refreshing, actually, to see people who were so firmly bonded to each other and to a specific place through bond of kinship. And I think that's in some ways at the heart of the sort of disconnect a lot of Westerners feel when they go to Malawi or somewhere like Malawi, is that they are approaching a people who are sort of almost quintessentially rooted in a particular place and a particular set of familial bonds. And our approach is always so much that of wandering nomads. It's funny, when I use that anywhere person reference, because when I was writing the book, I was reading David Goodhart's The Road to Somewhere. It had a very big influence on me. Don't know if that's a book that people are familiar with, but that was what he perceived to be, one of the great dividing lines in British society today, this division between people who are rooted to one place, a tradition, and all connected to a past that they feel is common, versus those that want to be able to dabble in whichever cultures catch their eye. And Malawi obviously provided the complete opposite of that, the people who live their whole lives confined within, I'm talking about the community of villagers that existed just outside the gates of the academy that I was thrown into. Because of course, the academy is not in Lilongwe, it's not in Blantyre, it's not in a big city, it's in properly rural Malawi. And I was very, very glad that was the case, and so allowed me to be immersed in that world. But these lives that are so hard and so short often, but lived in such a small, confined space. It was the exact opposite of me having rocked up there from 5,000 miles away as a fly-by-nighter, or like most of the other Westerners that I saw in the country.
And in the book, Dr. Highbrow encourages you to look beyond the cultural walls of the academy to the life of the village, where he says the real interest lies. You seem to find fascination in both.
As in both
worlds.
The academy and the village. Yes, I suppose it was the sort of union, the meeting of the two, which was mainly, as far as my experience went, achieved by these very eccentric classical scholars who had sort of somehow coalesced in Kasungu district, Malawi, thanks to Banda's strange experiment. Classical scholars for whom the world of Oxford that had produced them was no longer a particularly hospitable place for them. And yet they found in Malawi a freedom and a respect for the high academic standards that they'd come from, but also a culture that they were drawn to. So Dr. Highbrow's a synthesis of sort of a handful of different characters, but all from that strange background of classics in the UK, but then having washed up in rural Malawi. And when on one of my first meetings with him, yes, this is a safe house was the words that Dr. Highbrow used to describe the academy. by contrast with what he perceived to be the barbarism of Oxford.
You seem to admire Dr. Highbrow's knowledge of and appreciation for Malawian cultural beliefs and practices, and as well as drawing upon classical references and English literature, you quote extensively from the Malawian literary tradition. And as it was for Banda, respect for and upholding these beliefs in any missionary education, the likes of Father Boucher's interfaith services seems important to you.
So the well, I mean, the literary, I'm always astonished that a country with such a small population, so few resources, can produce such an extraordinarily rich and voluminous literature. I think it's one of the most striking things once you've got to know the country, but yet something that isn't broadly enough advertised. What struck me when I looked into it was how far back the tradition goes. I mean, we're familiar with the most famous Malawian writers, especially as poets, Panjay, Steve Chimambo, Peter entirely. But actually, they're part of a tradition that goes right back to the first contact with literacy in Western high culture through the missionaries. Was that sort of what you were driving at?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the other motivations with my book was a sense of indignation on behalf of a handful of missionaries who did so much to enrich Malawi's cultural and intellectual life. And this is setting aside their other remarkable achievements in extirpating slavery from the region, in bringing peace to a region where war and perennial famine had become completely normalized. And in many cases, they dedicated their lives to these causes when they could have pursued vastly more lucrative and more comfortable careers elsewhere. But even if you set all that aside, what I was interested in was this cultural life that they were able to foster. I was thinking there's one figure, there's several that I talk about in the book, but there's one in particular, by way of example, if you like, of Dr. Robert Laws, who is a titan of Victorian missionary endeavour, and yet consigned to almost complete oblivion in Britain today. Although in Malawi, you'll still only ever hear his name. I've only ever heard his name spoken with great respect. Now, Laws is inspired by the vision of Livingstone. He, as a boy, wants to follow Livingstone's footsteps. So he educates himself. He's from a very poor background. His father's a cabinet maker in Aberdeen. And he teaches himself Greek by borrowing a Greek grammar from a bookseller that he can't actually afford to buy himself. And he copies out the entire thing by hand. So it's self-education. And it's because he knows the story of Livingstone, who's come from even more dire poverty to improve himself. And his siblings' lives are all improved through education. So they've got this conviction about its power to advance social improvement. And so he gets himself to medical school because he wants to become a medical missionary and go to Africa. And it takes him a very long time. It takes him a decade of just suffering casualties of all his colleagues to infectious diseases and the predations of flavors before he's able to create this settlement, up in Livingstonia on a lofty plateau. So they're out of the malarial flatland. And what he achieves there, I mean, apart from he's physically laboring at the construction of the church where he's preaching, the hospital where he's operating, all of the infrastructure, which he's actually personally overseeing a huge amount of it. He teaches himself electrical engineering so that he can have the country's first hydroelectric station constructed up there. And with all this set aside, his real focus is education. And he comes into this land where literacy is virtually unknown. And to start with, he has to just learn the local languages. And it begins as fundamentally as pointing to a tree and asking for the name of it. And he masters 6. Then he's able to write a dictionary. Then he's able to produce a translation of the Bible. And only then is he in a position that he can teach his parishioners how to read it. And when he does so, he discovers there's this absolutely extraordinary appetite for education. The excitement that this generates is so powerful that he decides, well, actually, the sky's the limit here. He starts teaching them Latin and Greek and Hebrew and history and theology and literature. And it's explosive. The enthusiasm is really quite astonishing. So that northern Malawi becomes, within his own lifetime, one of the most educationally developed regions in the whole of British Africa. Now, I'll tell an anecdote, but it's helpful. I mean, there's an English anthropologist who goes to northern Malawi in the 1930s, sent from SOAS, and she's been sent to go and investigate levels of educational attainment in northern Malawi, where Laws was operating. And she's walking in the hills, and she comes upon a young Ngoni warrior, and he's got a book in his hand. She says, "What's that?" And it's Plato's Republic. Now, I related this story to a British civil servant, my own age, Oxford educated, English, who'd worked for DFID previously. And he physically winced when I told him the story. And grimacing just muttered something about cultural imperialism. Now, I would say that cultural imperialism is a grotesque misrepresentation of what Laws achieved in northern Malawi, because this intellectual life that he fostered, it was not just parroting the voices of colonial masters. It was producing people of genuinely independent minds who were the progenitors of independence movements, not just in Malawi, they diffused through Southern Africa. And just by example, the Nyasaland African Congress is drawn pretty much from the debating society at Livingstonia. Clements Kadali is the major figure in Black South African trade unionism, a graduate of Livingstonia. The parents of Kenneth Kaunda meet as teachers training at Livingstonia. So it was producing people who were genuinely thoughtful, independent-minded, critical. It produces writers, George Moise, who ends up writing a hagiography of Chilembwe and celebrating his uprising in a book that's studded with Latin quotation. So the idea that this was foisting an alien culture upon unwilling peoples is, to my mind, an appalling misrepresentation. It's an exalted culture which is sensitively grafted with a real appreciation of the local culture. And longer term, coming back to the literary tradition that we started with, it's at that point that I think you see the first, it's not even hints, this Malawian literary tradition just blooms into life so quickly, it's astonishing. And the writers that come subsequently, what strikes me about them, even the most recent writers, is they're all, a common theme in their work seems to me to be that they are embracing the power of the written word to celebrate, preserve, and revitalize Malawian culture that might otherwise have been lost without the power of literacy to preserve it. And I think that's a very strong feature of especially the work of Steve Chimambo, where so much is about taking oral literature and reworking it for a contemporary reader so that it's actually the life is restored to it. Jack Rapanje and Felix Montali. Now, obviously, a lot of their poetry is very political, and that tends to be the poetry that gets the most attention, and some of it is some of their best work. But I also think there's a big core that tends to get a little bit neglected, and the real focus of that is the celebration of Malawian culture.
Law's an incredible Renaissance man, and your admiration for him is clear. And as you said a second ago, you mentioned other missionaries as well, the university's mission to Central Africa, as you say, inspired by Livingstone, who said to go and continue my work that I've begun. John C. Maples and William Johnson in particular are some of the figures that you pick out. And you say the elimination of slavery from Central Africa by these young men strikes me as among the greatest moral achievements of modern times. I can think of no other that was made without compulsion to so great effect and in a spirit of such self-sacrifice. And the likes of Johnson being remembered in his parish with St. Johnson's Day speaks volumes to that, doesn't it?
Emphatically, yes. I mean, I remember before I went to Malawi, finding it such a strange conundrum when historical conundrum. I couldn't really understand. I couldn't form a mental vision of how such a big swathe of the world was converted to Christianity by such a small group of people and without the application of force. I always had presumed that sort of religious conversion must take place under conditions like those that the conquistadors took to South America. And it was only really when I looked into the history of Malawi that it began to be comprehensible to me. That it really was a handful of very dedicated, very brave men, also very cultured men, intelligent, sensitive men, who decided they'd risk their lives and set an example of peace and goodwill to all men. And because they arrived amidst societies that were at that point being shattered by external forces, there is in Malawi in the 1860s this convergence of Portuguese slavers coming from the east, Arab Swahili slavers coming from the coast with their Islamized African accomplices, and tribes of the Zulu diaspora pushing from the south to create conditions which could fairly be described as hell on earth. And in that context, I think the arrival of strange men suggesting peace on earth and goodwill to all men actually becomes so much more comprehensible why it was embraced so enthusiastically. And the courage of these men is what astonishes me, because the Westerners who do get in Malawi today go with such extraordinary resources to get them out if they're in trouble. The knowledge that however attached they become to the place, they can always return to security of a secure Western economy if they decide they want to give up on it. And these are men, William Johnson, Chauncey Maples, for example, who once they decided they were going to go to Malawi, the first thing they did was start working on, they started trying to decide what their epitaphs were going to be, in expectation that they'd be dead, quite possibly soon after arriving. And sure enough, the third friend who gets left out, Charles Jansen, he's dead within weeks of arrival. And Maples is dead a few years later. And Johnson goes pretty much blind from destructive tropical eye infection. But yes, again, against all expectations, yes, survives decades of the country. And there's this, I see this sort of failure to acknowledge this, which is what sort of was part of the sort of impulse to write this book. There's an extraordinary plaque in the cathedral in Zanzibar, the Anglican cathedral, and it reads, if I can remember it, to the glory of God and in memory of Livingstone and other explorers, men good and brave, who, to set free the slave, advance knowledge, and further Christ's kingdom, hasten Christ's kingdom in Africa, loved not their lives even unto death. And yet when I was there in the cathedral, there was a party of Scandinavian aid workers, whom I later befriended in the evening, who had no idea about what had been achieved, gawped at the plaque in the cathedral, had no idea they were standing in front of one of the world's greatest monuments to abolition, and just muttered something about, oh, well, they were all just colonialists, right? And when I consider the extraordinary comfort and facility with which those young people could dip in and out of life in Africa, and compare that with the sacrifices made by those missionaries, whose graves are now obviously littered throughout Malawi. Yes.
In contrast to the effort and sacrifice of those that you've mentioned, but also David Clement Scott has a particular place in your book as well.
Yes, so this is a very, very eccentric man who goes out to lead the Blantyre mission. Now, after the slight panegyric I just gave, I hope I've in no way whitewashed some of the worst that took place. And before David Clement Scott went out to Central Africa, the Blantyre mission, Scottish mission, had been managed shamelessly. It was brutal, it was murderous, it was exploitative. It was scandalous that mission was run under the aegis of a Christian mission organization. But when David Clement Scott goes out, because there is a scandal, and because the supporters of the mission are rightly outraged by what's been going on there, he takes charge, and you could not find a gentler, a nobler, a more curious person to lead the mission. He's from Edinburgh, he's middle class, he's very learned, he's a linguist, also a musicologist, and he is completely infatuated with local culture, to the point that he's sort of almost delirious in the sort of rhapsodizing that he writes. He's also a scholar, and he brings an extraordinary academic rigor, and that's another thing I suppose that struck me about the best of these missionaries from that generation, is that they'd all had a classical education, and so they could bring both the linguistic proficiency, the linguistic tools of having studied classics, so that they could study the local languages philologically and write these incredibly comprehensive grammars and dictionaries. And the other thing they got from their classics was they had a framework for how to take an overview of a completely different culture. And Scott is just fascinated by everything. It's from the lives of the different tribes he encounters, their rituals to their most basic handicrafts, to the flora and fauna, to the cooking. But most obsessed of all is he about the language. And he has this, he compiles this cyclopedic dictionary of the Manganja language, which is an absolute treasure trove of all of his observations of every aspect of life. And there's nothing that's too small to sort of escape his interest. And there's an incredible partiality to it. There are aspects of local life which others might deplore, and he even steps in and tries rather meekly to defend them. So there's even a slightly painful excuse for, yes, the throwing in of slaves or widows into a Yao chief's grave, and he tries to slightly exculpate the practice. And when it comes to the burning of witches, he's there censoriously reminding us, well, how long ago was it that we in the West stopped doing that? But it's with the language that he's most infatuated. He's got this extraordinary introduction where, before he gets into the hard nuts and bolts of the grammar, he writes this sort of love letter, if you like, to Manganja, and he says it's got the greatest expression of the abstract yet achieved by man. And this is someone who knew Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, and plenty of other languages as well. And he says, it speaks from out a cloud of glory. It is the witness of a perfect incarnation, and any who would surpass it must be as broad and as courteous as this language and this people declare the genius of Africa to be. Now, again, this view that you get classically expressed in Fanon or Edward Said, that Western missionaries only denigrated the local culture so that they could supplant it with their own. That did happen, of course it did, but it was not the whole story. And I'd advance someone like David Clement Scott as a superb example of a different approach. And the other thing just on David Clement Scott is that besides this cultural interest, he's also politically very active. So he's in the south, and he's in the Shire Highlands, which is where the worst land grabbing did take place in colonial Malawi. And he sets himself up as a champion of the rights of local people against the predations of exploitative settlers. And he effectively ruins his own career in championing that cause. But even though he has to take himself off to die a lonely death in Kenya, psychologically devastated as well, because by this point, his son, his wife, and his brother who are there with him have all died in the space of, I think, about 2 years. Takes himself off to Kenya, but he leaves behind these students that he's brought up in the spirit of, well, first of all, high learning, the Latin, the Greek, even teaches some Hebrew, but also the independent-mindedness and the critique that he offers them of the settler community as he sees it. So he is incredibly humane, very curious, open-minded, generous man, but again, consigned to complete historical oblivion outside Malawi.
Well, it's so important that we remember the terrible deeds that Scots have been involved in Malawi, as well as the positive ones. You mentioned Clement Scott's kind of rhapsodic absorption in cultural practices. The great dance in Sangala's village, the circling waves of women, the transformative art of the Guliwem Kulu that you hold alongside the Bakai, comparing with the much less edifying, I think, maybe hollow feeling rave in Oxford. This, I think, is the cultural expression of Chewa, people connecting with voices from the past.
Mm. So, yeah, certainly. Angule was something that I was enormously impressed with in Malawi. It took me quite a lot of time and sort of reflection to try and work out why it's was so powerful. Certainly, why it was so powerful to my imagination. And what I think the core was a realization that in some fundamental way, Goulet was actually very similar to what I was doing as a classicist. That sounds a bit glib. So Goulet is the supreme cultural expression of the Chewa people. It's a mass dance and danced by initiates, and each mask, each dancer conveys a different fable or moral message through his dance. And so you've got a potentially unlimited pantheon of different characters, although certain figures do recur a lot more commonly than others, and they can be historical figures, local figures, real figures, imaginary figures, the human world, the animal world, animal, vegetable, mineral. It can be inanimate objects, abstract objects, the minibus, the cyclone. It's effectively an unlimited range, and that's what gives it its variety and its versatility and its adaptability, and why it keeps being able to be fresh and relevant. But the thing that struck me and that I think is most important is that this is not entertainment. It's something centrally important to the life of that village. It's, in a fundamental way, it's religious, because the dancers, through participating in Goulet, cease to be themselves. There's an element of magic in it. When they don the masks, they actually become the spirit of the ancestors. And the purpose of Goulet is to facilitate that communication with the ancestors. The number of times I sought explanations in village in Kasungu district and got more or less the same answer. What is Goulet? Well, they are dead men who come out of the grave to dance for us, sometimes accompanied by a gesture towards the graveyard that lay in the near distance. And it's that idea of a very literal connection with the dead, with the past, that is so extraordinary to me about Goulet. And I saw it, and that's why I saw it, as fundamentally the same activity that I was engaged in studying classics. Because why do we learn Latin or Greek? Why do we put on a Greek play? It's to get that communication with the dead. And in the book, I deliberately pick out the fact that the poets I greatly admire, T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden, they both use this phrase, the communication of the dead. And Auden even goes so far as to say, without the communication of the dead, a fully human life is not possible. It's a literal description of Goulet, and it's a literal description of what you're trying to do when you dig up ancient languages. And I think it's also, from my perception, that's at the core of what makes these very vulnerable societies surprisingly robust in the face of all the hardship and insecurity that's thrown at them. They've got a cohesion which transcends the everyday hardship. It's that sense that they're part of some bigger project that transcends the everyday, that extends into the past and into the future. And I think probably contributes to that great fertility of Malawian village life.
You seem singularly unjudgmental throughout the book, perhaps only giving yourself rather harsh judgment for your direction on the Bacchae.
Well, so we tried to bring the two worlds together in the production of a Greek play. So we put on Euripides' Bacchae, which seemed appropriate because it's about the god Dionysus, who's in Greek mythology represents orgiastic frenzy and liberation of animal passion. We chose the Wole Soyinka translation or adaptation of the Bacchae because that sort of encouraged our feel for the universality of the play's message. But then we chose Goulet figures to represent the different characters. And so Dionysus was played by a figure dressed as Cimbano, who's the sort of mutant bull crocodile in Goulet. Monstrous, terrifying figure who's really there to encourage even greater feats of procreation amongst the villagers that he dances for. And we did a few times at the academy and in the village. It was not, it was limited in its success. It started well and then very rapidly degenerated into basically a performance of Goulet Wankulu. But it was that, I suppose, that forced me to think, actually, it doesn't really matter that it's degenerated into a performance of Goulet Wankulu, because it was sort of then that I began to think these are fundamentally such similar activities. Having said that, Dr. Highbrow, or at least the character that represents the largest chunk of the Dr. Highbrow character in the book, who's still in Malawi, and I think probably approaching his 20th year there, has continued that dramatic tradition with slow but steady success, and now puts on the annual International School Shakespeare Festival. And yes, I think just by persisting with it has made that interaction between academy and village very successful. But it's taken a decade of work to do that, and being consistent with it.
And we're lucky to be joined in the room and possibly online by different generations of people who've taught in Kamuzu Academy, and we'll turn to.
I thought you were going to tell me that Dr. Highbrow was
We'll turn
very
to
unnerving indeed.
Turn to open questions in 5 minutes or so. So please, online and in the room, do have any questions that you'd like to put to Alexander. What should we make of Banda's fascination with classics?
So there's a popular view which is to dismiss his classical obsession as fetish. That this was someone who possessed, the phrase has it, the colonized mind, that he was so infatuated with the culture of the country's colonial rulers that he set about this act of rather pitiful emulation. And there is an element of that. You think of the opening of Kamuzu Academy, and Banda stands up before this vast audience that includes not just pupils and masters, it's also got villagers, his Mpumba of dancing women, his Guli Wankulu dancers, and Ngoni warriors. And he stands up before them and proceeds to declaim, first of all, he says, anyone who doesn't want to learn Latin or Greek has no place at Kamuzu Academy. And then he starts to declaim page after page after page of Caesar's Gallic Wars in Latin. And John Tembo, who's just passed away, had already been needing to translate Kamuzu's English for the assembled audience. Now, confronted with the Latin, he says, Mwamba zimene mene Kamuzu. You heard what Kamuzu said. So, yes, there is this touch of the absurd, but I don't think that's the whole story. And to my mind, Kamuzu, for all of that silliness, is an intelligent man. He's a very learned man. He spent 12 years in full-time university education in America, doing a wide array of different subjects, from classics to medicine. He's on top of all that, he's got a unique life experience from having walked from the Malawian village to South Africa, scholarships in America, working in Scotland, working in Britain. He's got a unique perspective on both Western and African life. And to dismiss all that as that's just the colonized minds, I mean, to me, that smacks of a sort of neo-colonial arrogance, to dismiss all of that extraordinary achievement and knowledge and cultural experience. Now, I think there are lots of different aspects to Kamuzu's enthusiasm for classics, as well as the silliness that I've pointed to. But I think at the core of it, shall I end by talking about the Julius Caesar and is that a
Please, yeah. And I'm thinking, keen to hear
so-
about Carrie as well.
So an example of Kamuzu's bestialization, if you like, of classics. We went to catalogue the library at his abandoned palace in Gulianawambe, which is on the slopes of Mount Kasungu. And when I got there, it was everything I could possibly have dreamed it might be. It was like Miss Havisham's house reimagined in Africa. There were baboons scuttling from the forecourt as we approached. And inside there were termites eating away the corners of the silk wallpaper. There were cobwebs draped from the chandeliers. There was a nest of wild bees in the corner of the room. But there was a library, and it was clear that Banda was a serious reader, whatever exaggerations may have been made about his scholarship. And there was this adjacent strong room. The power had been disconnected a long time back, so we were exploring it with torches. And in the corner, in a heap, there's all these battered, dusty oil portraits. And I find Gaddafi's portraits, Nyerere's, Mugabe's. But underneath all of it, there's this little, very hefty oak chest, which I take out into the sunlight. And inside, there's a 1584 edition of Caesar's Gallic Wars, printed in Venice by the celebrated Renaissance press of Aldus Manutius. In other words, a prized antique edition of perhaps the most famous work of history. And it's installed there in his palace. Now, he'd embezzled a lot of money. He liked luxury. But this is not just your everyday gold taps and silk wallpaper. This is something much more interesting. And I think the fact that he installed it there is actually quite psychologically telling about Banda's relation with classics and with history. Because the palace itself has been built, the reason that site's been chosen is it's the site of a battlefield. The name is the place where Nwambe lost his shield. And as a child, he remembered being taken by a grandparent who had participated in the battle to be shown this place where his people had unexpectedly resisted an attack by the Ngoni. And had they not seen them off, perhaps his whole family would never have come into existence. So Banda's memorializing that battle by building his palace on that site. And that's part of a bigger personal project when he returns to Malawi after his separation of almost 40 years, where he's trying to reconnect with his past. He's trying to look up anything If there are trees which get memorialized, he thinks he remembers them. There are drinking wells that he thinks he remembered. He's clutching at anything that can connect him with the past that he was separated from for so long. He's asking relatives, in particular, about where his parents are buried. He can't find their graves. But something substantially has got is this memory of this battlefield site. And to my mind, the Gallic Wars is there as a talisman, if you like, that he installed in the palace, because in contrast to all of this history, which he's so frustrated has slipped from his grasp, in Caesar, you've got the power of the written word to preserve culture and history, not just from a generation before that everyone's now forgotten, but from distant millennia. And so I think that's why there's a constant emphasis on Julius Caesar. There are other details to it as well. I think, we were talking the other day about, he also likes Caesar because, he's famously, it's sort of an equalizing force, because it's talking about Caesar's campaigns amongst the barbarians of Gaul and Britain. And at independence, it enables him to give a lecture to the outgoing colonial administration saying, you were barbarians quite recently, and I know because I've read Caesar. And that is another aspect, but I think there is more fundamentally this infatuation with literacy, which again is part of that story from going back to Robert Laws and David Clement Scott.
Amazing access to that time capsule.
Indeed.
So I'm keen to pass over in just a second, but one last question. Ikari.
Yes.
I'm conscious of spoilers for anybody who's not quite reached the end yet or hasn't read, but we learn of Ikari, who Dr. Highbrow recognizes as a particularly gifted student and finds him a place at in Rome at the Academia Vivarium Novum, where everybody must speak in Latin or Greek. Ikari flourishes, goes on to do a master's at the University of Kentucky, I think. Is there an update?
There is. So Ikari, it's not his real name, so I feel more comfortable talking about him with that pseudonym. That I'm still in contact with. Ikari was a government scholar, so came to the Academy on a full scholarship from rural Machinga district, where his family are subsistence farmers. His father occasionally gets piecework, occasionally, so might then get $1 a day, if he's lucky. And Ikari came to Kamuzu Academy from that context and was particularly good at Latin and Greek. So when he completed his A-levels, we thought, well, he needs to pursue this at a higher level. And what we really wanted was to get him to Cambridge, because Keyes College has a full scholarship specifically for Malawians. There was no way he would be able to go to Cambridge without enormous financial support. And we tried twice, and the failure of interest was absolutely extraordinary. I should say he was short by, I think, 1 A-level point. I think in his third subject, whichever it was, not Latin or Greek, he got a C rather than a B, so didn't meet the minimum requirements. And try as we might to explain the peculiar, even unique circumstances of his background, there was this resolutely bureaucratized response that, well, it doesn't meet the minimum criteria. So, like all too many of the very gifted pupils from Kamuzu Academy from poor background, Ikari went back to his village and watched the maize rise for a couple of years, occasionally borrowing books from Dr. Highbrow to keep his oar in, but otherwise returning to the life of subsistence farming that his family had brought him into. But we eventually made contact with this very eccentric academy in Italy, run by a man called Luigi Miraglia, whose project is to resurrect spoken Latin and Greek and brings pupils from actually all over the world. Ikari was not the first from sub-Saharan Africa to attend, but was among the first. But there are pupils from China and Latin America, and they live this almost monastic life with very limited access to mobile phones or computers or internet. Strictly no modern languages. Even the handyman at the villa has to communicate in the sort of rudimentary Latin he's been forced to learn in order to discuss, points of plumbing and electricity with them. It is deeply frustrating because they lost my suitcase, and I was trying to sort of work out what had happened to it, and of course they just stubbornly insist on answering you in Latin, which is not a language which is suited to discussion of lost suitcases. And anyway, Ikari spends 2 years there, becomes completely fluent in Latin and almost as fluent in Greek. There's a lecture that he gives about his life experiences, which is on YouTube. He gives to the Paideia Institute, which I can't recommend highly enough to dip into. It's an hour long, and of course it is all in Latin, but the fluency is obvious. He wrote, for his dissertation that he had to produce to graduate from that academy, he wrote a 20,000 word essay in Latin on the role of free will in the philosophy of Seneca. And from there, he got to Kentucky, where he completed a master's degree, and I think is still very much interested in doing a PhD in classics, but has gone back to Malawi, briefly taught at the University of Malawi, and then taught for a little at Kamuzu Academy. But the happy update, and I was actually in communication with him earlier today, he's gone back to Rome, but this time with a different institute, an American classical institute called Paideia. And he's working for them in the Rome office, but he's resumed his connection with the Italian spoken Latin Academy. And they've got the plan they've got at the moment is, I would say it was fanciful, except that all of Miraglia's plans sound completely fanciful until he realizes them, which he invariably does. He wants to set up a satellite of spoken Latin in Lubumbashi, in Katanga province of the DRC. And I would scarcely believe it, but he's already received the delegation from Lubumbashi in Rome. So they seem pretty serious about it. And the idea now is that Chikondi might go out to lead this satellite spoken Latin institution in the Congo. So yes, that is the update from there.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Alexander. Through open to questions from the room online, and some that have been submitted at the point of registration. I imagine that Alexander would take questions in Chichewa, English, Latin, and Greek. That's just a guess.
Shall we?
Very easy one. What was the moment where you thought, I've got to write a book about this?
So I came back from Malawi. I wrote a couple of articles about the experience, and then one for an American magazine called The New Criterion. And it was remarkably popular. I was very surprised. The magazine told me it was one of their most read articles because they can monitor these things, online and so on. They'd had published. And as I simultaneously realized there was an appetite for it, I also realized there was so much more to the story that I could possibly encapsulate in even quite a long article. So it was a small essay, a longer essay, and then I realized actually there's just so much material here that I've not been able to include, that it's it makes sense to fill a book.
We'll go for one of the pre-submitted ones, and then Chara, if I may, I'll turn to you for an online question. Janet Parsons asks, Dr. Chula, as long ago resident of Hastings Bandas, Malawi, I'm aware of mistakes made in the establishment in the early years of Kamuzu Academy. In your opinion, could these have been avoided, and if so, how? In the period following Banda's removal from office, what were the main elements in failure in the nation to put right the excesses and injustices of the Banda years?
Well, I think I've got a certain amount of difficulty answering that, because I've tried quite diligently to avoid commenting on political questions relating to Malawi. I feel that's something very much for Malawians to bicker about, and goodness me, they do bicker about it, among themselves, and they can make their own judgments about Kamuzu's legacy, which I think are far more important than anything I can say on this subject. Why I felt emboldened to write about it was that I thought there were aspects of Kamuzu, in particular his personality and his cultural concerns, that were of more universal interest and needed to be known about outside Malawi. But for that reason, I focused on those and stayed clear, I think, of political questions. Do I want to try and give yes, an abbreviated version of my sort of diagnosis of Malawi's various pathologies? Probably not, actually. I think possibly for private discussion, but I'm very happy to do that. But I really do feel it's not my business. I think in general, there's too much of telling Malawians what's right and wrong with their country. And that's something I'm keen to sort of distance myself from, I suppose.
Very good. Thank you. There's an online question.
There's a couple of comments from Banda. I'm assuming it's not Kamuzu Banda, who's still with us. I don't know if Banda, if you'd like to unmute and possibly put on your video and ask your questions directly, or I can read them from the chat box.
I think you can. You can read them on my behalf.
Okay. They're closely related and touched on a little bit, I think, but I'll read through them. That was my question. 2, Banda's fascination with the classics. Did he assume that Western civilization was more superior to African forms of civilization? Carrying on, plus to some of you who have taught at Kamuzu Academy in the early 80s, like Jack Dawson, who has indicated here, I believe is also with us this evening. How did you take the notion that Banda did not want African/Malawian teachers to teach at Kamuzu Academy?
I think the question of superiority of one culture over another is a difficult one. There are regards in which I think the answer is obvious. In technology, be one example of where I don't think Banda, who studied medicine, would have any hesitation in saying, yes, what I've learnt, Western medicine is superior to the technical achievements of my own people. On a cultural level, it becomes much more difficult. And there's a point of interface between the two, particularly regarding literacy. And I think in that regard, probably yes, he would have been forced to say, because is literacy, is that a strictly technical achievement, or has it got a cultural, a spiritual, even a moral element to it? And he'd say, yes, this is an invaluable cultural jewel that we need to, that we can claim for ourselves and use for our own culture. On the more general question of how do you compare one culture to another, I say comparing Goulet with Greek tragedy. Do I think Greek tragedy is superior? Yes, I do. I think there's a richness there, an innovation there, an intellectual force there, which is almost unique in literature. But when you've got cultural expressions which are sincere, it's not just commercial culture that's doing nothing except trying to sell itself, but actually trying to say something important because its author has perceived something important about the world that they want to communicate to others and to future generations, then I think you get beyond the realm of comparison. And that's why I think when you've got sincere expressions like that, they can speak to each other, Goulet to Greek tragedy and vice versa, in a way that neither can really speak with a cheap commercial culture. But so once you're in that territory, I think you're dealing with things which transcend a sort of point of comparison. You might, as I just did, assert the technical, semi-technical merits, perhaps even spiritual merits of Greek tragedy, but they're both coming from such a sincere and deep place of human experience that I think trying to then say what is better or worse, they're both deliberate, valid contributions. And I think that's what Banda was probably, the idea that I think he probably, I don't know if he ever, would have articulated it in that way, but I think he was aware that he had two things, he had contact with two cultures that were both very precious and important to the people that had produced them. Not just important, were vitally important. And his experience of both, he thought, was a way of bringing them together and perhaps revitalizing them. On the teachers was the other aspect of this question. So this is obviously one of the great embarrassing features of Kamuzu Academy's original conception, that effectively all teachers had to be Westerners. My understanding is this wasn't prescribed in that way, but the prescription was that everyone had to know Latin, and that effectively precluded anyone who had not, and they had to know it to at least O level, and that effectively precluded anyone who hadn't been brought up in the Western education system. Yes, there is something deeply uncomfortable about that. And I can understand how much it would hurt if you were an intelligent, cultured Malawian and felt excluded from this great future for the country's future. And I think Banda was not a very sensitive man in some ways, I believe. But I do nevertheless respect the integrity of the vision, which is that he did want the best for the best Malawian peoples, however poor, that he could assemble. And however cruel and insensitive his way of going about that, and mistaken perhaps, there was a sincerity and integrity of purpose there, which, yes, I do respect.
There's a question in the room, and then we're going to go to David Humphreys, who submitted a question in advance. And I see, David, that you're online. I'll turn to you in a second, and then to Trevor Croft, who's also previously submitted a question. Sorry.
Yeah, I'll be brief. Thank you very much for your insights. Do you think it would have made more sense to have built a music academy at Livingstonia? Or do you think this choice arose from Banda had always an antipathy, I think, to people from the north, or the intellectuals from the north?
Yeah, it's funny, that's actually something that was raised at a talk the other day, and I suspect early on there's probably a measure of insecurity at the fact that he didn't himself get to Livingstonia, which he very much wanted to do, and because he can't get there, he set his heart on getting to Lovedale in South Africa, thinking, I'm going to even better Livingstonia, because Lovedale was reputed to offer the best education available to Africans anywhere on the continent, and particularly they offered Latin and Greek. So I think early on there probably was this degree of insecurity about having missed the Livingstonia experience. To what extent that persists later on, I'm not sure. I mean, he has, by the time he does come back to Malawi, you'd have thought accumulated enough academic clout to not still have that as a bugbear. I suspect probably the reasons for his antipathy isn't quite the right word. Uncomfortable relationship with the northern regions. There's probably more to it than just the Livingstonia element. In terms of whether the academy should have been built there instead, I mean, I think there's obviously a great centralizing vision that Kamuzu has in it, and also a determination to celebrate his own region, hence Lilongwe as well. So I think for him it would have been out of the question to have Kamuzu Academy anywhere other than in Tuntama, underneath the cherry tree where he, which he thought he'd identified as the right one, where he had his first lessons. But likewise Lilongwe. And there's obviously, insofar as I will perhaps, make a comment about a political aspect of Banda's rule, I think whatever complaints you might have about this preferential treatment given to the central region, Banda does exert an extraordinary unifying force on Malawi, which I think, as far as I detect it, from my followings of Malawian media and social media, is increasingly recognized by even critics of Banda. And so I think he would probably argue that that movement of power to the center of the country was an important part of that, and the creation of a new sense of nationhood that was going to transcend the tribal differences, all the while that he was, obviously fostering some of those differences. But the real tragedy, I would say, is that the university at Livingstonia didn't get established. That was obviously Laws's vision for the Overton Institute, but couldn't get the funding to achieve university status. And in those days, yes, I think it's made a reflection of how scrupulous people were. I'm sure in a similar situation today, there'd be no hesitation in just labeling it the University of Livingstonia, but he didn't buy the book and said, no, it's not a university, it's an institute. But
We try and squeeze in two more questions.
Yes, yes.
Alexander. David Humphreys, are you happy to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, certainly. Good evening. And I'd just like to say how much I've enjoyed the cultural side and the airing of a lot of the unique qualities of Malawian culture. But my question is more in the medical side. I have worked in many years ago in Malawian hospital system. I just wondered, to what extent nowadays is Malawi close to staffing its health systems with native Malawians? Many were going training when I was working there. Not all of them were coming back home. What do you feel about this?
Well, I mean, I'm certainly no expert on healthcare economics or the particular, sort of macroeconomic challenges faced by those trying to direct Malawi's system of healthcare. But you're absolutely right, and I don't think that's a problem that's limited to Malawi. I work in the NHS, and I'm completely accustomed to working with far more doctors from overseas and nurses and healthcare assistants from overseas than I am with native British healthcare workers. And excellent though they may be as colleagues, I'm constantly aware of a sense of embarrassment, really, that we have plundered this reserve of human capital from the rest of the world, all for the purposes of kind of keeping our faltering system, just about, not even particularly well, but just about on the tracks, with very scant regard for the depletion that causes in the countries where these people have come from.
Dr. John Banda.
As you know, I respect your steadfast refusal to engage in the politics. Okay, taking on from that one, as one of these doctors who never returned to Malawi, that's one. And then number two, this is not my version. I had a friend, Father Mali, who he went to Malawi, went to Malawi, and his prediction, we were just talking, he said, one of the Dr. Banda's legacy would be that Malawi would be from many Bandas. Okay, so if you go in office now, most offices are full of many Bandas. Grand executive, grand this and that, in that culture. And then the legacy of Kamuzu Academy, the cultural legacy, cultural, political, whatever, is that Banda was very meritocratic. Okay, so Kamuzu Academy was based on the system that only the best from each were taken. You can compare, what happened here. You might be best in primary school, in secondary school. It doesn't mean you could be best forever. So it took all the best. You were educated in his vision, plastics and all that stuff. Okay, so Malawi has a cohort of these people for Banda's vision. Okay, at the same time, when Banda was in London, I know I've got in my drawer a manuscript by somebody called John Perry. It was given to me by David Obadiri. John Perry was a very strong character. Him and Dr. Banda never appeared. John Perry never went back home. When I was publishing, I was supposed to publish this book, and I approached this children and they wanted so much money. It's still lying in my head. So Dr. Banda was a man who thought, I'm coming to the end of the question, he was the best. He knew everything. Okay? Now, the next stage, if you look at his education, now you do say he was a very educated man. So then he was MDCHP, Bachelor of Philosophy. He is not a PhD. Okay. In my view, Dr. Banda maybe was a very intelligent man. I would not put it in the intellectuality, some other African intellectual of the time. So he then says, I know it all you lecturers, Chancellor College, Felix Guntari, all the others, you know nothing. I am only. So that is a weak point in this, so do we then say he was right culturally to impose his own ideas on everybody else?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very valid point. And certainly there's exaggeration of Banda's intellectual prowess, which he, even if he doesn't necessarily always engage with himself, he's very happy for others to foster. There's that particularly silly biography of his that was never really published by Donald Brody. It's this work of extraordinary sycophancy that sort of imagines Banda is fluent in Hebrew, and Banda obviously allows this to be widely promulgated. I do accept that there is, that side. I think you're confronted though by the practical politics of post-independence Africa. Okay, he might not have been the most academically qualified, he might not have been the most intellectually powerful, but to be effective in that world, and compared with a lot of his peers, he was effective. You need a much wider array of skills. Now, if it was to sit down and have an academic debate about something, perhaps a debate about sophisticated cultural ideas especially, I'm sure there were indeed others who were better qualified, more interesting, more thoughtful, more powerful intellect bring to bear on that. But you need such a diversity of skills in any political role, but especially in that point in the continent's history. And because of it's not just academic, because of his life experiences, I think he does bring a lot to the table. He also brings an awful lot of problems and defects as well. But it's not just, for his intellectual caliber that we should be admiring him as, or yes, some of us might be admiring him for his leadership. But it's the way he combines a lot of different skills. And on the cultural point, I think the fact that he was sensitive to cultural concerns, that he was sensitive to the need to celebrate Malawian culture. A lot of post-independence African leaders pay lip service to this idea of culture. Mobutu would be a classic example. And for me, that was, or Idi Amin, let alone Bokassa, that really was fetish. For all its faults, with Banda, there is, I think, a sincerity of interest, and not just interest, a real concern for celebrating, all right, his own very idiosyncratic vision of Malawian culture, but it's a sincere vision. It's not just a Mobutu-style propaganda vision. I think he does believe it, and I think he's sensitive enough to see some of the complexities. One of the saddest things is, the way Banda responds to the literature that he himself has sought to foster. You go back to the 1930s, 40s, where he's consorting with Cullen Young, and they're trying to actually bring a Malawian literary tradition to life. And he writes this really moving introduction to the anthology, Our African Way of Life, in which he's pretty explicit, we're trying to preserve memories that will otherwise just slip from everyone's grasp. And to go from that to the brutal suppression of the very writers that emerge from the tradition he's tried to foster is one of the bitterest ironies of the Banda story for me. But that's not to say there wasn't, right at the start, a sincere belief in the value of the culture that he was trying to celebrate and preserve. Does that begin to provide an answer?
It's just this thing about, I know everything, you guys at Chancellor College, you don't know anything.
Yes.
And then he's saying, we're educating you. And then once you're educated, you cannot come back. And
Yeah.
I'm one of the doctors who stayed away. You couldn't go back. There's no way I was going to spend 4 years
Yes.
before you, like some of my friends did. So we stayed away. So at the same time, it might be just went to the high school from secondary school. When we went to secondary school, my father said, don't go to university. Because I was going to do the PhD in political science. So I went to high school, so then I could get a scholarship to do architecture, medicine, somewhere like that. So no sooner than we go to high school, we find out some of our friends who went to Chancellor College were getting £6 a month stipend because it was a university. We treated Banda Secondary School as pupils. So I don't know who started, but we put a petition. They were semi-good, and some of us were even better. I hope this later is still in our head.
I don't want to bring this to a close, but it's perhaps one that we need to continue after.
So we spent 2 weeks waiting to get our. Now this before Camus is important. Before Camus Academy actually gives a positive for Banda. So we spent 2 weeks sweating. We were going to be sent home. 2 weeks later, the answer came back, yes, you're going to get your £6. So that was before Camus Academy, when he wanted to send people to develop the country, engineers, architects, and everything. And then Camus Academy came. If we had done that after Camus Academy, it would have all been thrown out.
Can I make a brief, what I would absolutely, I accept all of that, John. And obviously besides the monstrosity, the corruption, the brutality, the mismanagement, there's also an enormous, absolutely enormous arrogance to Kamuzu Banda. But what I would say is the great irony of all this is that it's a reaction to that, it's a response to that, that stimulates this incredible flowering of Malawian intellectuals. And I suggest that from the stories that you've told me, a big part of your motivation was defiance towards Banda. Now, obviously that wasn't his intention, but it's I think now that time has passed and you look back, you can see that so many of the greatest Malawian writers are in this strange symbiotic relationship with Kamuzu, where their defiance to him is almost what brings about their most brilliant writing.
Trevor Croft, I hope you'll forgive me voicing up your question rather than turning to you, but having promised that we would hear your question, I want to honour that, but just with time in mind. You asked the palace near Kasungu, where the book was found, is that the old Kasungu State House on the banks of the hill west of the town? And if so, what is the future of the building?
It may have been on the site of the old state house. There's certainly I couldn't detect even a palimpsest of that remaining. It's very much a new, not new. Banda obviously very much built a new structure there. It's obviously in rack and ruin, as you would expect. As being the fate of yes, dare I say, most infrastructure in in Malawi. Its future, I think, is very uncertain. I suppose will depend entirely on what the family decide to do with it. It was the arena there was used, I think, fairly recently for a Shakespeare festival. I casually wonder whether it might lend itself to being a satellite of the Academy Vivarium Novum and their spoken Latin projects around the world. But that would be for the family, I think, to make their mind up.
And lastly, with my eyes, I can't quite read the comments on the screen, but I'm reliably informed by colleagues, Daisy Belfield Santos, you took over from Alexander at Kamuzu Academy. Do you want to come in very briefly?
I do. Hello, Alex. And I promise I will be brief. I haven't, to my shame, yet read the book, but I very much enjoyed all the pseudonyms. And so my question is, I really admire your agnosticism towards cultural appropriation, and I could really get behind you when you said that I think you said you push back against the idea that you can't write about a place because you're not from that place. So my interest is, why did Alexander Subsang become Alexander Chula?
Daisy.
Just very briefly.
You weren't supposed to give that away. It's rather prosaic. I wanted to keep my medical and literary identities separate. I'm not actually particularly concerned with people reading the book and then looking me up and finding out that I'm a doctor. My concern is a very practical one. I meet a huge array of patients, and inevitably, on a regular basis, some of those interactions are difficult, and it is them that I don't want looking up and discovering my literary identity, rather than the other way around, if that makes sense. So it's rather humdrum, I'm afraid, Daisy. There's no great mystical story or anything.
But the pseudonyms elsewhere as well are fantastic, and I can't.
And I should emphasise that with Dr. Highbrow, it's very much a synthesis of different characters, and I've taken a little bit of a great many different classics teachers at Kamuzu Academy in order to create the whole that is Dr. Highbrow. I mean, you know very well who forms the biggest chunk of it, and probably the second biggest chunk. But you are yourself, I think, incorporated somewhere in that character. So.
There's an incentive to read the book, Daisy.
I'm feeling very remiss. I can also just add a footnote on Akari, that I'm now working for Cambridge as part of its Classics Beyond Borders programme, and they've shown an active interest in Akari and have asked me to get in touch with him. And I think there is some retrospective regret at their lack of interest. So watch this space. I think it's not over yet.
Well, if they'd like to support a satellite of spoken Latin at Ngulia Wambe, I think a way for them to atone for their failure of interest before.
And can I just add that Chula isn't exactly a pseudonym, so it isn't a name that we plucked out of the air to adopt. There was some controversy over Alex using a pseudonym, but.
Yes, yeah, it is. So it is actually my middle name. It also is coincidentally a word Chichewa, but that was just a happy coincidence. It's actually is my middle name. It's a Thai name.
Well, Alexander, thank you so very much. It's a fascinating book. I think we'll all agree. Thank you to Kelly Falconer, Alexander's literary agent, to editor Edward, to Jamie from Berlin Polygon, the publishers, to the Scottish Government for funding us, the Scotland Malawi Partnership, to bring everybody together, to all of you for coming in person in these times of hybrid events, to everybody for taking the time to join from home or wherever you are, to my colleagues, to Chad, to Dorothea, and to Natasha for doing all of the organizational work for tonight's event. There are books available in the foyer, and perhaps Alexander would be happy to sign them.
It's very much a doctor's school, but yeah.
Very good.
Thank you, Stuart.
So, a pleasure. Thank you very much, everybody.